digitally. Whoops. So I put a student to work on this. That's what graduate students are for. I happen to know that there'd been a very long-term, consistent set of weather records taken in the town of Volksrust, in Mpumalanga. And so we went and accessed that in the archives at Weather Service, the piles and piles of books still written in the original. And he sat down, for a month, banging this in day by day. And there's the analysis that comes out of it. So a couple of interesting things here. So if we look at the maximum temperature over the period of just over 100 years, there is an upward trend, and it is statistically significant, of around about half a degree per century over that period of time. Stronger trend is in the nighttime temperature, the minimum temperature. The nighttime temperature has gone up at nearly 2.5 degrees Celsius per year over that period, and very strongly significant. Less than a 1 chance in 1,000 that is a spurious result. So we would, as scientists, be quite comfortable saying the temperature in Volksrust over the last century has got warmer. And the interesting thing is the difference between the slopes of the Tmax and the Tmin. And that is one of the diagnostics of greenhouse gas caused climate change. If it was, for instance, as is often put forward, oh no, the warming that we're seeing is actually just a rebound from the medieval cold period around the world, and we're just seeing part of a cycle here. You would expect the daytime temperatures and the nighttime temperatures to show exactly the same signal. And the fact that they don't is diagnostic of the particular physics which is introduced by enhanced greenhouse effect. So that's one of the little signals which confirm that the mechanism we're looking here is an increase in the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. When we look at rainfall trends in South Africa, we find the same issue that has been found globally. There is no overall annual rainfall trend in South Africa. There is just variation around a mean. There may be a trend in there. It is not detectable at this stage. Sometimes you can pick out a statistical trend in various places around the world, around the country, but there is no overall coherence in that. If you unpacked rainfall and didn't go for such a gross measure as, for instance, just what's the annual total, but tried to look at, for instance, has it shifted earlier in the year or has it shifted later in the year? Is it coming in bigger storms versus smaller storms? Then you start picking up some statistically significant changes. But in the sort of overall assessment, very little. And you can see why when we look at, again, the rainfall record for Volksrust, a daily record going back 110 years, what we see is an indication that there may in fact be a trend line in there. Okay, so look at the variation, huge, okay, but there may be a trend line in there. But when we apply the statistics to it, P of 0.16, okay, that's a 1 chance in 6 that this could be pure, just spurious. Okay, now scientifically, that's not a risk that we were willing to take. All right, we would only start saying, look, there's a big issue coming on here when it comes to about 1 to 20, a P of smaller than 0.05. It would reach about 0.05. If that trend is real, it would reach it, in a decade or two out here. And so I think we'll see a lot more clarity about rainfall trends over the next few decades. This is particularly important because, of course, for many South African purposes, for water resource management, for agriculture, it's the rainfall. Okay, the rainfall really matters. And so knowing which way the rainfall goes is important. And we don't have a lot of clarity from the model projections. And the reason for that is that South Africa has sort of two things going on simultaneously. It's got a bunch of sort of tropically influenced rainfall processes going along on the eastern side, also influenced by the sort of West African monsoonal effects. And then it's got these more temperate westerly wave influenced things going on the western side. And when you run the models forward, the models are actually quite consistent about changes in those two systems, but they disagree about where the one system dominates and the other system dominates. So what happens is that if you're looking at a place like Johannesburg, some of the model runs suggest it gets wetter because there's a more influence of this eastern process. Some of them say it gets dry because those models are suggesting that the western set of processes dominate more. And so it's where you sit on the seesaw becomes really important. And so that's why the rainfall projections for South Africa are kind of so iffy-butty. Well, maybe then, because we really are unable to say with a great deal of clarity about whether that increasing rainfall trend, which we're likely to see on the far eastern side of the country, will dominate over this drying trend, which we are likely to see on the western side, where that transition occurs. And this particular data set comes pretty much on the hinge. Okay, it comes from here. And so it's interesting that the suggestion is likely to be a drier rather than a wetter, even that far to the east. And the problem is, of course, that the statistical significance is not at a level where you would actually be able to say, where you'd be able to base policy on such a finding. So you have to treat it essentially as a scenario, saying, look, here's a possibility. There's a bunch of other reasons why we have problems with water supplies in the country, which have nothing to do with climate change. They have due to the fact that we live in a dry country and our demand has gone up so much that we're running out of water all over the show. Climate change has a probability of making this exacerbating that problem. We need to plan for that possibility. It's not a certainty. So let's just unpack this notion of detection and attribution. So detecting a change, statistically, something has happened over the past period of time. That you apply sort of statistical methods to it, and that's all reasonably straightforward. The problem of attribution is a much more difficult one. Say, yes, we have seen that something has changed. It has changed because of X. Okay, saying that with confidence is a much more difficult problem. So essentially, you've got a time series of observations, whatever they are, rainfall, temperature, atmospheric CO2, or whatever. Detecting whether there's been a change is actually relatively straightforward. Okay, and increasingly we're seeing all of these indicators around the climate system coming up with flashing red lights. So across the board, it's temperature, it's rainfall, it's sea level rise, it's glacier retreat, lots and lots of indicators showing that there is a detectable change. All right, but saying that detectable change is because of elevated CO2 becomes a more difficult problem. That problem has by and large been resolved, and I'll go on to that in a moment. So in that detection and attribution of change within the climate system, that case is basically now closed. Okay. Where we still have a detection and attribution problem is downstream of that, saying, okay, so the climate has changed, therefore these are the impacts. So our maize yields have gone up or gone down. All right. So now, proving that our maize yields have gone up and gone down, that's a statistical problem, and you can solve that. Proving that they went up or down because of climate becomes actually a much more difficult thing, because there's all sorts of other things going on. You're changing your cultivars, you're no longer growing the same maize. You've changed your area planted. You're changing your management processes. You're now applying irrigation or not applying irrigation, or more fertilizer or less fertilizer. So you've got to unscramble all of those contributing factors before you can get to an attribution. And so if you kind of look at the structure of, for instance, the IPCC reports, they are traditionally structured into these three things, which is volume one, which is kind of the climate system and is dominated by climatologists and physical scientists. And basically, their job is kind of done and dusted. Shown that the world's climate is changing, demonstrated what the main processes are, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so they're all perfectly happy with detection and attribution. Volume 2 is around the kind of so what, the impacts on things that we actually really matter to us. So impacts on biodiversity, on food security, on water resources, on human settlements, etc. There, we're halfway down that process. There's a lot of detection of change there. okay? Much less attribution. There is some processes which have been attributed, but by no means all of them. And then you get to the third section of the IPCC reports, which are the kind of, what would you do about this? The sort of technological and other interventions. And there, it's a much more difficult to do even detection, let alone attribution, because there's all these issues of human agency involved, you know, people making decisions for all kinds of multiple reasons. So if we were to do the attribution problem, okay, not the detection problem, that's basically straight statistics once you've sorted your data out. This is essentially the approach that you take. Firstly, you exclude, so remember, I'm talking to an audience of scientists here, so you all understand the problems of falsification versus what's the opposite of falsification? I'm missing the word, but confirmation. Okay, confirmation versus falsification. You can confirm a thing repeatedly until you get a blue into the face. You still actually haven't proven it. Okay, whereas if you falsify it just once, okay, it's nailed. So falsification is a more powerful approach to the problem than is confirmation. And so the first thing that you do is that you apply, you work through all your other plausible alternatives. And if you can falsify those, you can take them off the table. Okay, so you go through those, and there's a whole bunch of those that come up. Solar variation, orbital variations, volcanoes, all those things go into the mix, and you exclude those as causes. And then you posit a hypothesis. I think that this is what's going. And there does have to be a positive correlation with that, okay? That doesn't prove it. If you just establish a positive correlation between here's a causal factor and here's a consequential factor, there's a positive correlation, therefore it's proof. No, we all learn that in first year that correlation is not causation. You actually have to do a more sophisticated experiment than that. And so what you try to look for is predictions which are unique to that mechanism. So if this is the mechanism operating, these are the unique predictions which only come out of that mechanism, and then you go and you look and see if those signals are there. And there are a bunch of those associated with the enhanced greenhouse effect. We've talked about the nighttime temperature rise being greater than the daytime temperature range. For similar kind of physical logic to do with the radiative balance of the Earth, we would expect the winters to be getting warmer than the summers. We would expect the interior to be warming up more than the coastline, more than the oceans, okay? We would expect the poles, okay, to be warm, and the subtropics, in fact, to be warming up at a faster rate than the global mean. In other words, at a greater rate than the tropics and the temperate areas. We'd expect the lower atmosphere to be warming up faster than the upper atmosphere. We would expect, for instance, changes in storm intensity to be greater than changes in storm frequency. And so you can go through all of these kind of fingerprint analyses and see whether they are valid. And in fact, all of those are valid. The other thing you can do is you say, well, the gold standard for scientific proof is the experiment. So if we're trying to prove that this drug has an effect as it claims, what we do is we take a random sample of the population, we assign them into a with treatment and a without treatment, and preferably that should be done double blind, so not even the experimenter knows that, and then we apply it for a certain length of time, and then we test statistically if there's a difference in the population. So that's the kind of standard. Unfortunately, we only have one world. So you can't replicate that experiment. You can't say, well, okay, let's say that we had 100 worlds, we'd put 50 of them into the, anthropogenic greenhouse gas, and then we'd, keep it constant for the other 50 and see what happens. We can't do that, okay, but we can do it virtually. And the way we do that is we actually create simulated worlds. So the whole area of global climate simulation is truly a remarkable 20th century achievement. I know we all like to poke fun at it. They got the weather prediction wrong, okay? We forget actually how often they get it right. And in the broad sense of getting the general patterns of the global climate system, which is a complex system, okay, very complex system, the simulations are truly remarkable. They get the patterns, they get the Hadley cells right, they get the seasonal variation right, they get almost everything actually right on the button. So it is a remarkable thing. I think that when we look back in 200 years' time on what were the signal achievements of science during the sort of late part of the 20th century, the ability to simulate the global circulation system will be one of those achievements. So we take those models, okay, and we apply experiments to those, because there you've got a model world, and so you can do what you like. You can take out the anthropogenic, forcing. You can fiddle around with the orbital forcing. You can do, essentially play with it as you like. You also don't ever base this stuff on a single run. Okay, back in the day when this was all, run on sort of one supercomputer in the world, and it took 5 years to run a simulation, you were very limited in the number of experiments you could do. Nowadays, there's more than 30 groups around the world doing this, okay? They run hundreds of simulations, and so you end up with an ensemble, a very large number of simulations on any of these experiments. And you take the average of that ensemble, you don't take any individual of that. So now we can run a little experiment. We can say, well, what happens if we, so the black line here is the observed temperature trend over the past century, well, 1860 to 2000, past 150 years. The red line is the model simulation, and the yellow spread around it is the variation in the ensemble. Okay, and you can see that when you put in the natural effects only, so everything that we know that affects the global climate system, wobbles in the orbits, eruption of Mount Pinatubo, everything that we know goes into there, our best shot. What we get in terms of the simulation is an interesting internal dynamic. Remember, the world climate system, because it's a complex system, has its internal variations and dynamics. But we get no secular trend, okay? It just remains carrying on, bouncing around as it kind of naturally would. We don't capture this rise in temperature. On the other hand, if we ignore the natural things going on, we just look at the greenhouse gas forcing. So we then take our records of emissions going back to the past period, and we put those into the model. Okay, again, same convention. Black line is the actual record with all of its variation, and here is the simulated trend. We get this increasing, exponentially increasing warming. Doesn't quite match, okay, and it doesn't have all this interesting dynamic. Okay, so it's getting a kind of a secular trend in there, but it's not picking up the dynamics. And you can see the intermodal variation range as well.